Right, before we get into this, I want to be honest with you. When I first saw this story drop, I genuinely did not know how to feel about it, because on one hand, you look at the player and you think, yes, absolutely, that is the level Arsenal need. And on the other hand, you look at the situation surrounding it and you think this is going to be one of the most complicated transfer stories of the entire summer. And I have been sitting with that tension ever since. There is also one detail buried inside this story that almost nobody is talking about. We will get to that. And when we do, I think it will change how you see this entire situation. So let me start with something that I think a lot of people are not talking about clearly enough. Arsenal's left wing does not exist after June 2026. Not weakened, not uncertain, gone. Gabriel Martinelli contract expires this summer. Leandro Trossard contract expires this summer. Two of the three players who have occupied that left side of Arteta's attack for the past 2 seasons are walking out the door in a matter of months. And right now, there is no confirmed replacement for either of them. This detail matters more than people realise because it reframes the entire conversation. That is the reality sitting behind this story. And once you understand that reality, genuinely sit with it for a moment, the name Kvaratskhelia stops sounding like a fantasy and starts sounding like a necessity. Now, The Independent have reported that Arsenal are actively investigating whether a move for the Paris Saint-Germain winger is possible this summer. And I want to be precise about what that means because the language really does matter here. Arsenal are not in negotiations. There is no bid on the table. This is not advanced. What this is right now is Arsenal's recruitment team asking one fundamental question. Is there even a conversation to be had? That is where we are. Early interest, appetite testing. And honestly, that framing tells us more about Arsenal's situation than any transfer fee ever could. So let's get into this properly. And stay with me because the further we go into this analysis, the more complex and the more interesting it becomes. The first thing you need to understand about Kvaratskhelia, and I think this gets lost in a lot of the coverage, is that he is not a traditional wide forward. He never has been. Even back at Napoli, when he was tearing Serie A apart in that brilliant title-winning season under Spalletti, what made him genuinely special was not pace down the line or whipping crosses from the byline. It was his ability to receive the ball in tight spaces, change direction quickly, and make the right decision under pressure in the final third. Well, he is at his core a problem solver with the ball at his feet, a player who creates options that simply did not exist a second before he received the pass. Here is the part most viewers missed about his move to PSG, and this matters directly for the Arsenal conversation, so keep this in mind. He joined in January 2025 for around £60 million, and in the 18 months since, something interesting has happened. He has adapted to a completely different tactical environment and kept performing this season across all competitions, around 12 goals, 7 assists, 37 appearances in the Champions League alone. 7 goals, 3 of them in a single tie against Chelsea, a tie PSG won 8-2 on aggregate, by the way. He is not a player who goes quiet in big moments. He shows up in them. And I know as Arsenal supporters watching that Chelsea tie, the quality of those performances was not easy to watch from a neutral perspective because you could see exactly what that player is and exactly what he would mean to this club. Now, here is the point that I think is really important, and I want you to hold this thought because it becomes central to everything else we discuss today. And Luis Enrique's PSG is not a simple system. It demands pressing intelligence, positional discipline, the ability to function within a collective rather than just expressing yourself as an individual. Kvaratskhelia has done all of that. He has genuinely matured as a footballer since leaving Napoli. And that maturity is precisely what makes him interesting to a manager with the specific demands of Mikel Arteta. Which brings me to the tactical question, does he actually fit? Because this is where things get more revealing than most people expect. Here is what I think gets missed in most of these transfer conversations. Arteta does not want a traditional winger on the left side of his attack. He has never wanted that. What he wants is a player who can invert from the left, operate in the half space between the opposition's defensive and midfield lines, combine quickly in tight areas, and press intelligently when Arsenal are out of possession. That profile is very specific, and it is not a long list, not even close, of players in world football who can do all of those things at the level required for a Champions League winning project. Kvaratskhelia can, comfortably. His movement from wide left into central areas, his pressing triggers, his combination ability in confined spaces, it all maps directly onto what Arteta wants from that position. This is where things get really compelling. This is not a round peg in a square hole situation. This is a player who looks like he was designed for this system. And then you add Viktor Gyökeres and the picture becomes even more interesting. Arsenal signed Gyökeres last summer for around £55 million. His goals return has not been quite as explosive as many hoped early on, that is fair to say. But structurally, the partnership between a mobile physical centre-forward and a creative inverted left-winger who drifts into pockets is exactly the kind of combination that causes serious defensive problems. Gyökeres pulls centre-backs, Kvaratskhelia exploits the space left behind. On paper, that is genuinely dangerous. That is the kind of forward pairing that wins titles. So the tactical case clean. The question now is everything around it. But this is where everything shifts, because what I'm about to show you changes the financial picture in a way that most of the reporting has not fully addressed. Let me be direct with you about the obstacles, because they are real and they deserve to be treated seriously. But start with PSG. Paris Saint-Germain won the Champions League last season. They are defending that title right now with Kvaratskhelia as one of their most important players. He is not squad depth at PSG. He is not someone they can move on and quietly replace. He is central to what Luis Enrique is building, and the club have been explicit he is not available. Sky Sports reported PSG's internal view on this clearly. The language used was that he is the jewel of their current project. You do not sell the jewel of your project. Simple as that. Now, every club in football has a price. That is true. But there is a meaningful difference between having a price and being willing to engage in a negotiation. Right now, PSG are not willing to engage. And when you factor in that Kvaratskhelia only arrived 17 months ago, has 3 years remaining on his contract, and helped them win a historic sextuple in 2025, you start to understand the strength of their position. If Arsenal was somehow to force PSG into a conversation, we are talking north of 90, probably closer to £100 million as a starting point before wages. Wages at PSG's level around £250,000 per week. That is the total financial commitment required. And here is the critical context that I do not think enough people are including in this conversation. This is the part that I think completely reframes the likelihood of this deal. Arsenal spent £248 million last summer. Zubimendi, Gyökeres, Eze, Madueke, Mosquera, Nergard, Kepa, a complete rebuild in one window. The Premier League squad cost ratio regulations now mean Arsenal cannot simply go back to that level without significant player sales happening first. This deal does not exist in isolation, it is dependent on what leaves the club before anything comes in. That financial constraint is the quiet engine driving every single Arsenal transfer conversation this summer. So the club are constrained, the selling club are resistant. And then, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting and where my own view on this story shifted, there is the player himself. I want you to take his recent comments seriously, not as PR noise, not as something to scroll past, actually take them seriously. And I will be honest, when I first read these comments, they genuinely surprised me, because this is not a player giving vague diplomatic answers. This is a player who sounds completely at home. Kvaratskhelia told a French newspaper recently that Paris is, in his words, truly incredible, that he loves everything about it, that when PSG first contacted him, his wife was the happiest person in the world. He talked about walking around the city with her. He said it is the best city for that. That is a settled man. That is a happy man. That is not a player lying awake at night wondering if something better exists somewhere else. And look, in modern football, you cannot manufacture a transfer without the player's genuine desire to move. You simply cannot. His representatives have reportedly not closed the door on a future move. That is what The Independent are reporting. But not closing a door is a very different thing from walking through it. So here is the question, the real question at the centre of all of this. And I am going to answer it directly in a moment, but I want to make sure the context is fully in place first, because the answer only makes sense once you have seen everything. If the fee is theoretically possible, if Arsenal can structure the finances through player sales, and if the players' camp has technically left the door ajar, what scenario actually exists in which Paris Saint-Germain say yes? Because right now I am struggling to draw that map, and I think every Arsenal supporter watching this deserves an honest answer to that, not just optimism. The honest answer is that it requires a confluence of events, not a single decision. PSG would need to conclude internally that the financial offer is simply too large to refuse. And simultaneously, Kvaratskhelia would need to privately communicate to his club that he wants the move. Both things must happen at the same time. Neither is currently in motion. That is why I assess the probability of this deal happening this summer as low, not zero, but genuinely low. Now here is that detail I mentioned at the very beginning, the one that almost nobody is talking about. This is where things changed for me when I was working through this analysis, and I think it is actually the most strategically important element of this entire story. Arsenal have quietly not offered Gabriel Martinelli a new contract. Think about what that means. Really think about it. Martinelli has been at Arsenal since 2019. Fan favourite, key player, part of the core of this rebuild from the very beginning. And I know how much he means to supporters. I understand that completely, but the club have looked at his output, assessed his consistency, measured the level required to win the Champions League, and decided not to commit his future. That is not an accidental administrative oversight. That is a deliberate football decision. Something important is being communicated here, and we need to understand what it actually means for where Arsenal are going. It tells you that Arteta and the recruitment team have identified the left wing position as one that needs to be elevated, not maintained, elevated. Martinelli is a good Premier League winger. He is not a Champions League winning winger in the way that Saka is. The club understand that distinction, and their silence on his contract is the evidence. Kvaratskhelia would not be arriving to do what Martinelli does, only slightly better. He would be arriving to shift what this Arsenal attack is capable of at the very highest level. That is a fundamentally different conversation, and if you understand it that way, the fee starts to make a different kind of sense. There is one more piece of context worth adding here. Noni Madueke. Arsenal signed him last summer from Chelsea for around £48 million. Right-footed, direct, useful on the left in a counter-attacking context. A good signing, but he was never the answer to the left-wing question in the long term. If Kvaratskhelia arrives, Madueke becomes intelligent rotation, quality depth. That is not a failure of recruitment. That is a squad-building strategy that actually works. And that point connects directly to what I want to show you next about how the summer window could unfold, because the sequencing of events matters enormously here. Right, let me give you my honest read on where this goes from here, because that is what this analysis is ultimately building towards. The Champions League quarter-final draw is crucial. Arsenal and PSG are both in the last 8. They could meet. If they do, this transfer story moves from background noise to the dominant narrative of European football for 3 weeks. Any match between those two clubs with this story running underneath is going to be extraordinary to observe from every angle. And for Arsenal supporters, it would be the most emotionally loaded fixture of the season. A rematch against the club that knocked us out last year, with one of their players potentially on his way to North London. I understand what that would feel like. Believe me, watch Martinelli's contract situation specifically. The moment that story becomes public, and it will before the season ends, the left wing vacancy at Arsenal becomes official. That changes the dynamic entirely. It accelerates the urgency and gives the board a clear mandate to act. And when that moment arrives, the market will move quickly. And on the alternative scenario, because there has to be one, and this is the part I think is genuinely underappreciated, Anthony Gordon at Newcastle United is the most credible plan B in this market. 24 years old, English, playing at a consistently high level, with Newcastle having clear financial motivation to sell. Gordon is not a consolation prize. He is a different profile, more direct, stronger in transition, physically assertive, but he is a serious player who would improve this Arsenal attack. If Kvaratskhelia proves impossible, and it may well prove exactly that, Gordon is the intelligent pivot, not the disappointed fallback, the intelligent pivot. Here is what I want to leave you with, because this is the point that matters most when you pull back from the transfer noise and think clearly about where Arsenal actually stand. Arsenal are top of the Premier League. They are in the Champions League quarter-finals. Arteta has built a squad capable of competing at the highest level of European football. The spine of this team is extraordinary. Raya, Saliba, Gabriel, Rice, Odegaard, Saka. The structure is genuinely there. The culture is there. The belief is there. And I think if we are being honest as Arsenal supporters, we all feel that this group is closer than it has ever been. The left wing is the final structural gap between Arsenal as a serious contender and Arsenal as a sustained dynasty. One position, one decision. And the club know it better than anyone. Kvaratskhelia is the premium answer to that question. Alongside Saka and Gyökeres, he would complete a forward unit that very few defensive systems in world football handle comfortably. That is not hyperbole. That is just looking at the profiles and doing the arithmetic. But here is the thing about premium answers. Football does not always deliver them on schedule. Sometimes the premium answer is settled in Paris, married to the city, with 3 years on his contract playing for the reigning European champions and genuinely not looking for a way out. In that case, and I want to be clear about this, Arsenal's job is not to sit and wait. Arsenal's job is to find the best available answer and execute it without hesitation, because the one thing this squad cannot afford to enter 2026 to 27 with is that left-wing position still unresolved. What gives me confidence, real confidence, not supporter optimism, is the track record. Arteta and this recruitment team identified Gyökeres before the noise caught up. They moved for Zubimendi when everyone said it was impossible. They identified Eze as a profile that fit before most people were connecting those dots. They have been right consistently in this rebuild, and I have no good reason to believe they will get this one wrong. The name on the shirt next August matters less than the quality of the decision that puts it there. And if Arsenal make the right call, whether that name is Kvaratskhelia or Gordon or someone we have not started discussing yet, then this squad has everything it needs to go further than any Arsenal side has gone in a very long time. That is my read, but I want to know yours. Who do you think Arsenal should go for this summer? Is Kvaratskhelia worth the fight? Or do you think Gordon is actually the smarter move for where this club is right now? Let me know in the comments. Genuinely, I read them, and that debate is one I want to have with you. I am Andrew. This is Andy Gunners Live. Stay with us, because between now and the end of this season, there is a great deal more to come.